Imagine being a little girl barely old enough to play with dolls or skip rope in a muddy village street, suddenly told by your parents that tomorrow you will become a wife. Not just a wife, but the possession of a man 2, 3, sometimes 4 times your age. A stranger who may see you not as a child, but as a piece of property, an asset in a deal, or worse, a body to be controlled and used. This was not a nightmare. This was reality in the Middle Ages. When we talk about the child brides of medieval Europe, we are not dealing with fairy tales or romanticized stories of noble weddings inside candlelit cathedrals. We are dealing with a brutal truth. Girls as young as 7, 8, and 9 were often married off to powerful men in arrangements where they had no choice, no voice, and no escape. Their lives were shaped not by dreams, but by contracts, politics, and survival. And the consequences, they were horrifying. From the dangers of childbirth, while still a child themselves, to the psychological torment of being ripped from their homes and forced into adult roles far too soon, the experiences of these girls were nothing short of tragic trials of endurance. But why was this practice so common? And how did society, deeply religious, governed by strict laws, yet brutal in its execution, justify such cruelty against its most vulnerable? That is what we are going to uncover in this video. We'll journey deep into the shadows of medieval marriage customs, exploring the legal loopholes that allowed children to be married, the shocking rituals and humiliating tests these brides were forced to endure, the role of the church and monarchs in protecting or exploiting this system, and the dark fate awaiting many of these young girls once the doors of marriage closed behind them. Before we begin, let me pause for just a moment. If you're fascinated by these forgotten dark corners of medieval history, the kind of history no school textbook dares to mention, then make sure to subscribe to Past of Medieval and hit the bell icon. This way, you won't miss our future dives into the strange, disturbing, and unbelievable realities of the Middle Ages. Alright, let's step back into the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries, where childhood could end not with play, but with a wedding veil. And as we peel back the layers of medieval marriage, you'll see just how horrific the trials faced by child brides truly were. To understand why child brides existed in the Middle Ages, we need to step into the legal and religious framework of the time. Unlike today, where marriage is often defined as a union of love, or at least adult consent, the medieval world saw marriage as something else entirely. It was a contractor transfer of wealth, land, or alliances, and in this contract, a child's body could be bargained as easily as a field or a flock of sheep. Now here is the shocking part. The Church itself set the rules that allowed this to happen. Canon Law, law of the Catholic Church, that governed much of Europe, stated that the minimum legal age for marriage was 12 for girls and 14 for boys. Imagine that. At 12, a girl who had barely begun to grow into her teenage years could be considered a fully legitimate bride. And while this was the official age, things were often far murkier in practice. There were plenty of loopholes. Betrothals could be made even earlier, sometimes when the children were mere infants. Powerful families would arrange marriages between toddlers, sealing alliances long before the children had any comprehension of what was happening. The union might not be consummated until the girl reached puberty, but the promise was binding, and from that moment on, her life path was sealed. Even worse, medieval society often ignored its own legal thresholds. A girl of 9, 10, or 11 could still be pushed into marriage if her family and a willing husband agreed. And because the church valued consent, in theory, over age, a single statement, like "I will," was enough. A frightened child, pressured in front of parents, priests, and lords, would not dare say otherwise. With those words, her fate was sealed. And what about love? Forget it. Marriage wasn't about affection or romance. It was about property, alliances, and heirs. For noble families, daughters were bargaining chips. A young princess might be promised to a prince in another kingdom before she could even speak properly. The moment she was old enough, she would be sent away, sometimes across entire continents, to wed a man she had never met. These were political pawns, traded on the great chessboard of medieval power struggles. But it wasn't only the nobility. In rural villages, peasant families might marry off a young daughter simply to ease the financial burden of raising her. Another mouth to feed could mean hunger for everyone, so marrying her early meant survival for the rest. To the parents, this was practical. To the girl, it was the end of her childhood. The horror of it all lies in how normal this was. People did not see these unions as shocking or cruel, they saw them as practical, necessary, even sacred. The church blessed them, kings and lords encouraged them, and families accepted them, and the children themselves. Their voices were almost never heard. But the trials didn't stop at the wedding ceremony. The real torment often began afterward, because once the vows were exchanged, the child bride had to endure humiliating virginity tests, brutal consummation rituals, and the expectation of becoming a mother, while her own body was still too young to safely carry a child. This is where the story turns even darker, because medieval society not only allowed child marriages, it actively designed cruel traditions to ensure those marriages were valid. So, the vows were spoken. A trembling child, dressed in garments far too grand for her small frame, was now officially a wife. The prayers had been said, the contract signed, the feast prepared. But in the eyes of the church and the community, the marriage wasn't truly valid until one thing happened: consummation. And this is where the medieval obsession with virginity turned a wedding night into a scene of horror. In medieval society, a woman's worth was bound almost entirely to her chastity. Virginity was not just a moral ideal, it was proof of honor, purity, and legitimacy. A marriage without a virgin bride was seen as tainted, dishonorable, and even dangerous for the family's reputation. And so, the moment a child bride entered her husband's home, the weight of that expectation bore down on her tiny shoulders. Now, you may be wondering, how could anyone possibly prove virginity? The answer is disturbing. The virginity tests medieval communities developed humiliating and often cruel rituals designed to test a bride's purity. One common method was the inspection of the hymen, a deeply invasive and, of course, medically unreliable practice. Midwives, matrons, or sometimes even priests were tasked with examining the young girl's body to ensure she was untouched. In other cases, the proof was demanded after consummation. A white sheet would be laid on the marriage bed, and after the wedding night, it would be displayed to the gathered household or even the community. Bloodstains on the sheet were taken as confirmation of virginity. No blood, whispers of scandal began, and the bride might be accused of impurity even if she was merely too young for her body to bleed at all. Imagine the terror of a 12-year-old girl knowing that her entire future, her honor, her survival, her family's reputation depended on something so cruelly misunderstood. The nightmare of consummation for child brides, the wedding night, was not a celebration of love. It was often a night of pain, fear, and humiliation. Their husbands, usually much older men, expected obedience and submission. A girl who resisted might be forced, sometimes violently, into proving the marriage, and the worst part, this was not seen as abuse. It was seen as a duty. Society expected a wife, even a child, to fulfill her husband's needs. The girl's suffering was irrelevant, her cries dismissed as natural or even necessary. What mattered was that the union produced an heir. Medical writings of the time, filled with superstition and ignorance, actually encouraged consummation at a young age. Some medieval physicians argued that it was healthy for girls to become sexually active once they reached puberty, even if their bodies were nowhere near ready for childbirth. Others claimed it would open the womb or make the girl a more obedient wife. These ideas, cloaked in the authority of scholarship, gave legitimacy to what was essentially sanctioned abuse. The public spectacle, to make matters even worse, consummation was sometimes treated as a public affair. While not always literally witnessed, there were cases where noble weddings required attendants to wait outside the bridal chamber, listening for signs that the union had been sealed. In rare but horrifying instances, members of the court or family would actually remain in the room, turning the most private and traumatic moment of a child's life into a grotesque performance. If bloodstains appeared, they were paraded around like trophies. If not, the shame fell squarely on the bride. She might be interrogated, shamed, or even returned to her family in disgrace. This brutal obsession with virginity placed girls in an impossible position. They were too young to understand, too powerless to resist, and yet judged with a cruelty that defies belief. And this was only the beginning, because for many child brides, the nightmare didn't end with one night. It continued into months and years of forced pregnancies, dangerous childbirth, and sometimes even death in the very act of trying to produce heirs. If the wedding night was a nightmare, then what came after was even worse. Because for child brides, the true trial of marriage was not simply obedience. nor even survival through humiliation. It was childbirth. In the Middle Ages, childbirth was already one of the most dangerous events a woman could face. Even grown women in their 20s and 30s risked death every time they gave birth. For child brides often still barely into puberty, the dangers multiplied beyond imagination. The fragile body of a child mother, a girl of 12 or 13, might technically have begun menstruation, but her body was far from ready for the brutal demands of carrying and delivering a child. Her bones were not fully formed, her hips too narrow, her strength too slight. Pregnancy placed a heavy burden on her immature body, draining her of nutrients and stunting her own growth. Many child brides who became pregnant suffered not only exhaustion and illness, but also permanent physical deformities. Some developed what modern medicine recognizes as obstetric fistula, devastating injury caused by prolonged, obstructed labor. This left them incontinent, shunned, and often left to die in misery. And yet, despite the obvious dangers, society celebrated pregnancy as proof of a successful marriage. A girl who conceived early was praised for her fertility. If she failed, blame often fell on her alone. Never the much older husband, never the system that forced her into this role. The death chamber of medieval childbirth. Imagine the scene. A stone chamber, dimly lit, filled with the scents of herbs, sweat, and fear. The midwife, sometimes skilled, sometimes dangerously ignorant, stood, ready with her knives, oils, and charms. The child bride lay on a straw mattress, surrounded by women chanting prayers, whispering superstitions, and fumbling for remedies. In medieval Europe, medicine was a confusing blend of faith, astrology, and half-remembered knowledge from the ancients. Midwives tied charms to the girl's body to ward off demons. Astrologers were consulted to predict whether the birth would succeed or fail. Doctors recommended bizarre treatments, such as pressing warm wine to the belly or rubbing animal fat on the hips to ease the child's passage. But when the labor dragged anas, it often did for small, underdeveloped girls. There was little that could be done. Some endured days of agony, their screams echoing through stone halls, until finally, silence fell. For many, childbirth was simply another word for execution. Child deaths, and the cruel cycle, and what of the children born to child brides? The infants were often weak, premature, or stillborn. Those who lived were seen as triumphs, but survival rates were grim. Medieval records show shockingly high infant mortality. Sometimes more than half of all babies born would not live past their first year. But the cruelty did not end there. A girl who survived childbirth was expected to return to her husband's bed within weeks. Her body, still broken, was forced once again into submission. And so the cycle continued, pregnancy after pregnancy, pain after pain, until either the girl died or she aged into the role society expected of her. The horrors of noble child brides. Even among royalty, where resources were abundant, child brides fared no better. Consider Isabella of Valois, married to England's Richard II at just 6 years old. Though she was spared immediate consummation, the expectation loomed over her as she grew. Or Margaret Beaufort, who at 12 years old gave birth to the future Henry VII. Her labor was so traumatic that she was left unable to have more children for the rest of her life. For every named example, there were countless forgotten girls' peasant daughters. Merchants' children, village brides whose fates were sealed by families eager for alliances or wealth. Their names vanished from history, their suffering recorded only in silence, the Church's blessing. Perhaps the most disturbing part of all was that the system had the blessing of the Church. Medieval theology taught that women's greatest role was motherhood, and childbearing was seen as both natural and holy even when forced upon children. Priests would bless the bed of a bride barely in her teens, declaring it a sacred duty to be fruitful and multiply. The suffering of these girls was not seen as cruelty, it was seen as God's will. And so in the dim candlelight of medieval Europe, child brides endured not only the terror of the wedding night, but also the looming shadow of childbirth, an ordeal that claimed countless young lives and turned the very idea of family into a death sentence. For child brides in the Middle Ages, the horrors of marriage were not limited to the physical dangers of the wedding night or the life-threatening ordeal of childbirth. Beyond the body, there was the crushing weight of obedience. From the moment vows were spoken, the girl's childhood was over. Her laughter, her games, her carefree moments of innocence were replaced with strict rules, unyielding discipline, and the suffocating demand to submit. to her husband, to his family, and to a society that believed she had no voice of her own. The doctrine of obedience medieval culture was steeped in the idea that women were inherently weaker, morally flawed, and naturally suited to servitude. The church reinforced this doctrine by citing the story of Eve. Woman as the cause of sin, woman as the reason for man's downfall. Thus, a child bride was taught from the very start that her place was one of silence and obedience. Priests and confessor manuals often instructed husbands to rule their wives firmly, for a woman left unchecked was seen as a danger to both her household and her soul. For a little girl entering this world, her new identity was not daughter, not child, but servant. The husband as master, we must remember that these marriages were not unions of equals. A husband could be decades older than his bride, already hardened by war, politics, or the struggles of running an estate. To him, his new wife was a possession, a tool to expand his family's wealth or lineage. She was expected to bow when he entered the room, to serve him meals, to address him with titles of respect, sometimes even calling him my lord rather than by name. Any disobedience, even small, could lead to punishment. Some manuals written for noblemen openly advised that a husband had the right to beat his wife if she disobeyed, and if she were only a girl of 12 or 13, she had little chance to resist. The loss of childhood, think of what this meant for the girl herself. Just months before, she may have played with dolls made of cloth or sung songs with her friends in the fields. She may have dreamed of feasts, festivals, and stories told by the fire. Now, those same hands that once held toys were expected to spin wool, cook meals, and manage servants. Her playtime was replaced by endless labor. She was no longer treated as a child, she was a wife, and soon a mother. And yet, inside her, she was still just a child. She missed her family. She missed her freedom. She cried at night when no one could hear. This psychological torment, the stripping away of innocence, was perhaps the cruelest punishment of all. Surveillance and isolation for many child brides, marriage also meant isolation. Once brought into her husband's household, she was cut off from her parents, her siblings, her friends. Visits were rare and often controlled by her husband's family. Some girls, especially those married into noble or royal households, found themselves surrounded by hostile stepmothers, watchful servants, and strangers who whispered behind their backs. They were expected to stay in the women's quarters, learning embroidery, managing linens, or caring for younger children. Every move was monitored. Every word weighed. She could not speak freely, could not dream openly. The burden of honor, a medieval bride's duty, extended beyond obedience to her husband. She carried the crushing responsibility of her family's honor. If she failed to act modestly, if rumors spread about her conduct, it was not just her reputation at risk, it was her entire bloodline. A child could not comprehend such weight, but society demanded it nonetheless. Her behavior, her silence, her chastity were seen as reflections of the men who controlled her. Even laughter in the wrong company could bring accusations of impropriety. And impropriety could bring punishment. Punishments for defiance. What happened if a child bride resisted, if she dared to speak back or refused to submit? The punishments were brutal. A husband could lock her in a chamber for days without food. He could beat her with rods. In extreme cases, especially in noble families, defiant brides were sent to convents, forced into cloisters as a form of lifelong imprisonment. And the most terrifying truth was that society approved. The husband's authority was seen as natural and divine. If a girl wept or resisted, she was not seen as a victim, she was seen as sinful. The silent prison, so the girl learned silence. She learned to nod her head, to bow, to obey. She learned to hide her tears behind smiles, to push her dreams deep into the shadows of her mind. The cage was not always made of stone or iron. Sometimes it was made of silence, of fear, of duty. And for countless child brides in the Middle Ages, this invisible prison lasted a lifetime. And yet, as cruel as obedience and isolation were, the dangers did not end there. Because for many child brides, their lives could be torn apart, not only by their husbands, but by politics, war, and betrayal. If the crushing obedience expected of child brides was not enough, their suffering deepened when we step into the world of politics, power, and war. Because in the Middle Ages, marriage was rarely about love, it was about alliances. And who better to use as pawns than little girls who had no power to resist? Marriage as a weapon. To medieval kings, lords, and bishops, A child bride was not a daughter, not a person, not even a wife in the modern sense. She was a weapon, a tool for forging bonds, uniting kingdoms, or ending wars. If a nobleman wanted to secure a neighboring castle, he would promise his daughter sometimes as young as 7 to the lord who owned it. If a king wanted peace with a rival kingdom, he would sign a treaty, sealed not with ink, but with the marriage of his little girl to the enemy's prince. The girl herself had no voice in this matter. She was simply given away like a piece of land, a sum of money, or a herd of livestock. Her value was in her body and bloodline, not her thoughts, not her dreams. The queen, as a child, there are chilling records of child brides being crowned queens. One moment, they were in a nursery, playing with toys. The next, they were draped in heavy robes, sitting on a throne, and forced to act like rulers of kingdoms they could not even understand. Imagine a 12-year-old girl standing in a grand cathedral, the air thick with incense, bishops chanting Latin she could not follow, as a crown weighing more than her head was placed upon her brow. To the crowd, it was a moment of triumph. To her, it was terror. She could not read the document she was signing, nor grasp the deadly stakes of the world she had just entered. Her marriage was not a wedding, it was a contract of war, sealed in her blood. The Game of Thrones, in the violent game of medieval politics, these child brides became pawns, and pawns were expendable. If her marriage alliance failed, the girl paid the price. If her husband died, she could be remarried sometimes within weeks. If her family fell from power, she could be cast aside, imprisoned, or even executed. Some child brides found themselves widowed before they were even old enough to have children. Others were caught in endless cycles of forced marriages, treated as bargaining chips to be moved across the chessboard again and again. And behind every decision was cold calculation. Who could gain the most land, the most soldiers, the most influence? The girl's body was simply the battlefield on which these ambitions were fought. The terror of betrayal, but the most horrific part of this political web was betrayal. Because in medieval courts, alliances shifted like sand. One day, a child bride could be hailed as the savior of peace. The next, she could be declared an enemy, a traitor, even a witch. Imagine being 12, married to a foreign prince, and then suddenly finding yourself accused of treason because your father lost a war back home. Overnight, the same nobles who bowed before you now spit at your feet. You could be locked away in a tower, stripped of your title, your children taken from you. In some cases, the very man you were forced to marry could be the one who ordered your punishment or execution. The child bride as a prisoner of state, many child brides became literal prisoners of politics. Some were confined to castles under honorable custody, guarded night and day. They were not beaten, not starved, but they were trapped, never allowed to leave, their futures dictated by whoever won the next war. Others were sent to convents against their will. Though cloisters were meant to be holy sanctuaries, for these girls they were prisons of stone and silence. Cut off from the world, they spent their lives behind cold walls, their youth buried with the chants of nuns. The weight of a kingdom on a child for a child bride. This was perhaps the cruelest torment. She carried not only the crushing burden of marriage, but the fate of entire kingdoms. If she failed to give birth to a son, wars could break out. If she acted with the wrong courtesy, alliances could shatter. If she was accused of infidelity, even falsely blood could run in the streets. And yet, she had no power, no say, no choice. She was a prisoner in gowns of silk, locked in a gilded cage of politics and betrayal. A pawn with no escape, every move she made was dictated by others. Every word was monitored. Every breath she took was weighed against the ambitions of men, far older and far more ruthless than her. And when she outlived her usefulness, she was discarded. Some were poisoned, some vanished into dungeons. Others were quietly replaced with younger brides, as though their lives had never mattered at all. The child bride was, in truth, a pawn, and pawns in the medieval Game of Thrones rarely survived the match. But the horrors did not stop at politics. Because beyond the marriage bed, beyond the throne room, beyond the endless betrayals of power, there was yet another layer of torment, the body itself. For medieval child brides, pregnancy and childbirth became the deadliest trial of all. If political betrayal and forced obedience crushed child brides in spirit, what came next crushed them in flesh. Because for a girl in the Middle Ages, marriage almost always led to the same terrifying demand: children. But childbirth in the medieval world was not a blessing. It was a battlefield. too young to bear life. Today, we know that the body of a child, especially one barely entering puberty, is not ready to endure pregnancy. Her bones are still growing, her pelvis not wide enough, her strength too fragile. And yet, medieval child brides were pushed into motherhood as soon as their bodies could conceive. Some were as young as 12 or 13. Their wedding nights followed quickly by pregnancies that their bodies simply could not withstand. Imagine the terror. A girl who had only just stopped playing with dolls, now forced to carry a child within her, her belly swelling, her body breaking under a burden it was never meant to bear. The chamber of birth. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was not only agonizing, it was deadly. There were no antiseptics, no pain relief, no safe hospitals. The birthing chamber was usually a small, dim room filled with women, midwives, older relatives, sometimes neighbors. Candles flickered, herbs burned, prayers whispered. The girl would be laid on a straw-stuffed mattress, or even a wooden board. She would grip sheets, clutch ropes, or bite down on cloth as waves of pain tore through her young body. There was screaming, blood, sweat, sometimes hours or even days of agony, and for child brides, whose bodies were too small, childbirth could be a slow, torturous death. The horror of obstructed labor, one of the most nightmarish dangers, was obstructed labor. A young bride's narrow pelvis often meant that the baby could not pass through. With no surgical help, she would be left in excruciating pain, sometimes for 2 or 3 days, her body tearing itself apart. In some cases, both mother and child died together. In others, desperate midwives used crude tools, sharp knives, or even forced to pull the baby out often, killing the mother in the process. The survival rate for child brides was tragically low. Many never lived to see their 16th birthday. The silent killer infection, even when a child bride survived childbirth, danger still lingered. With no knowledge of germs or hygiene, midwives often reused cloths, tools, and even bare hands, spreading deadly infections. What began as fever and weakness could quickly turn into days of agony as infections spread through the body. Some mothers died slowly, rotting from within, while priests muttered prayers and husbands already planned their next marriage. The curse of the fistula. There was another horrific fate that awaited many young brides. Obstetric fistula. When obstructed labor tore through the body, it could leave behind internal wounds that never healed. This meant the girl was left unable to control her own bodily functions. She would leak urine or feces constantly, unable to stop it. The result, she was often cast aside, abandoned by her husband, hidden away in convents or remote houses. She was considered cursed, unclean, even punished by God. And remember, these were not grown women. These were children girls forced to become mothers before they had even finished being daughters. The demand for sons, but the cruelty did not end with survival. If she managed to live through childbirth, she then faced another impossible burden. Producing sons, daughters were considered a failure. If a girl bride gave birth to girls, she was scorned, blamed, sometimes even accused of sin or witchcraft. Husbands, impatient and ruthless, often forced pregnancy after pregnancy until she either gave birth to a boy or died trying. For some child brides, their entire short lives were little more than cycles of conception, pain, childbirth, and mourning. The child who lost her childhood, it is almost unbearable to imagine. At 12, 13, or 14, many girls had already lived through what most adults today would call a lifetime of suffering. They were forced to marry strangers, endure abuse, suffer pregnancies that shattered their bodies, and face death before they even understood life. Their girlhood was stolen, their futures erased, their names often forgotten. The cruel normality, and perhaps the most chilling part, this was normal. For medieval society, there was nothing shocking about it. No outrage, no compassion, no resistance. It was simply the way things were. Priests preached it, families accepted it, husbands demanded it, and children paid the price. The graveyard of innocence, churchyards across medieval Europe became silent witnesses to this tragedy. Countless unmarked graves hold the remains of child brides girls who died in childbirth, or who were buried alongside the infants they could not deliver alive. These graveyards were the final resting place of children who should have been running, laughing, learning, but instead were sacrificed to the cruel demands of power, patriarchy, and survival. But the story doesn't end here, because even if a child bride survived the torment of childbirth, her suffering often continued in ways that were far more psychological than physical. If the physical toll of being a child bride was horrifying, the emotional torment was perhaps even more haunting. Because what is left of a childhood when it is stolen, twisted, and replaced with silence, obedience, and fear? What happens to the mind of a child who is told her life belongs not to herself, but to her husband, her family, and her God? The isolation of the bridal cage. For many young brides, marriage was a prison without walls. Once taken into her husband's household, she was cut off from her family, her friends, and the world she knew. The laughter of siblings, the comfort of a mother's embrace, the carefree play of childhood, all gone in an instant. Her new life was filled with strict rules, constant supervision, and the expectation of submission. She could not wander, she could not choose, she could not speak freely. She was a child placed into a role she did not understand, surrounded by adults who demanded she act like a woman. The silence was crushing. Imagine being 12 years old, left alone in a vast stone castle or a dark rural home, with no one your own age to speak to, no toys, no lessons, no friends, just endless waiting. Waiting to serve, waiting to please, waiting to give birth. It was a loneliness that hollowed out the soul. The loss of identity, marriage, did not just take a child's body, took her very self. The moment she married, her name often changed. She became wife before she was ever truly a girl. Her husband's family erased her past, reshaped her future, and demanded she forget who she once was. If she ever resisted, she was scolded, beaten, or reminded of her duty. The terrifying truth was that many of these girls were not seen as people at all. They were symbols. Pawns for family alliances, vessels for heirs, trophies for men's pride. Their feelings, their dreams, their inner lives were irrelevant. The world demanded silence from them, and silence they gave. The burden of trauma, but silence does not erase pen, it buries it. Some child brides carried their trauma for life. Even if they survived marriage and childbirth, they remained broken inside, haunted by what was taken from them. Many lived with fear of intimacy, terror of pregnancy, or the despair of losing child after child. Others became bitter, cold, or resigned, their spirits dimmed by years of forced obedience. And the tragedy? Society did not see this as abuse. It saw it as duty fulfilled. The few who resisted. Of course, there were exceptions, girls who, through sheer will or circumstance, resisted the weight of their fate. Some became nuns, fleeing into convents, where despite strict discipline, they found refuge from forced marriages. Others wielded rare political power, like queens, who turned their unwanted marriages into opportunities for influence. But for every rare girl who carved out freedom, countless more remained trapped. The story of child brides in the Middle Ages is not one of victory, it is one of loss. The forgotten voices. What makes this history so chilling is how icily it was forgotten. For centuries, these girls left behind no diaries, no letters, no monuments to their suffering. Their stories were erased by silence. We only know fragments from church records, from family accounts, from the skeletal remains of girls who died far too young. Their pain was swallowed by history, dismissed as custom, normalized as tradition. And yet, if we listen closely, we can still hear the echo of their voices. Small, frightened, silenced. The legacy that lingers. And here's the darkest truth of all. The suffering of child brides did not end in the Middle Ages. Even today, in parts of the world, child marriage continues. Millions of girls every year are forced to marry men they did not choose, trapped in cycles of abuse and trauma that mirrored those of their medieval sisters. The story of child brides is not just medieval history, it is a human story, repeated across centuries, a story of power crushing innocence, of silence replacing laughter, of futures stolen before they even began. The child who never grew up. When we picture the Middle Ages, we often imagine kings and castles, knights and battles, feasts and tournaments. But behind those grand images lies a far darker truth. The everyday suffering of those whose lives were deemed expendable. The child bride was one of the most tragic figures of that world. She was a girl who never got to be a girl, a life cut short by duty, by patriarchy, by cruelty disguised as custom. Her grave may be unmarked, her story forgotten by history books, but her suffering demands to be remembered. A final reflection, so the next time we imagine the romance of medieval weddings or the pageantry of noble marriages, let us remember what they often truly were. Acts of violence against children. Behind the wedding veils were tears. Behind the vows was fear. Behind the silence was unimaginable pain. And if this story has unsettled you, good, it should, because history's darkest truths deserve to be spoken aloud. And if you want to uncover more shocking and hidden realities of the medieval world, make sure you subscribe to Past of Medieval, hit that like button, share this video with others, and join me next time as we peel back another layer of history's most disturbing secrets. Because the past is not just about kings and castles, it's about the forgotten voices that demand to be heard.